Ever since regular show wrapped up nearly 7 years ago, the general consensus is that the love triangle between Mordecai, Margaret, and CJ was one of the worst parts of the series. And while the younger me of 7 years ago, who much preferred the wackier shenanigans of the show, would have definitely agreed with that sentiment, as an adult looking back at those storylines, as awkward as they were, there definitely is something about this aspect of the show that I just didn't fully appreciate at the time. In fact, there are multiple episodes about Mordecai bungling his romances that I distinctly remember disliking at the time that are just genuinely really impressive to the me of a decade later, and perhaps none as much as Merry Christmas Mordecai. And that's what we're talking about today. In this AmpleSamuel Christmas Eve special, we're going to go through 11 of some of the hardest to watch minutes I've ever talked about on this channel and discuss how, in between some classically great regular show jokes, the series perfectly portrays this uniquely somber feeling of messing up in front of somebody you care about.
Party, and CJ's at the party, and I'm at the party. It's gonna be
a party?
Oh!
The episode starts off as classically as any episode of regular show can, with Rigby and Mordecai easing us into things by rapping about Christmas to Eileen inside the coffee shop. Besides just having some of the regular show charm that you definitely start to miss if you haven't seen this show in quite some time, this opener also features Mordecai talking about how excited he is for his first Christmas with CJ, and how quickly that excitement fades when he learns that Margaret is coming back to town. While Mordecai being anxious and anxious about being awkward is nothing new for the show, I'm not sure any episode goes as far with it as Merry Christmas Mordecai, as besides just these first few moments, there is not a single line with him throughout this entire episode that doesn't sound like it's coming from somebody who's entirely on edge. Mordecai is so busy freaking out and imagining all of the horrible ways that his first post-relationship interaction with Margaret could go that he can't even make himself stay in the coffee shop long enough to hear Eileen's mysterious third announcement, as it will continue to hang over the episode for the next 10 minutes. While there is a lot of fantastic jokes in this one, I think my favorite brand of gag in this episode is all of the times that Rigby or some other character gives Mordecai actually pretty solid advice about how he's overreacting to everything, only for the episode to later, either immediately or towards the end of the episode, refute that claim. With this being my favorite example of it here.
She's not gonna be lurking around every corner in the city.
Mordecai?
It's actually really interesting that the show chooses to not save Mordecai's reunion with Margaret until the Christmas party, as they trade some of that tension in order to get him and the audience on the same page about what's going to happen. Before this moment, even though the audience should hopefully have been very aware that Mordecai was going to pull a Mordecai and somehow jack everything up, in universe, the character could still cling on to the idea that perhaps things were not going to be awkward and that everything might work out in the end. However, after failing to have any semblance of a real conversation with Margaret, even without the presence of his new girlfriend, Mordecai becomes painfully aware of his doomed situation and spends the rest of the episode acting like it too. Despite knowing well what's going to happen to him, Mordecai is still ultimately bullied into Rigby by going to the party anyway. And since I'm going to spend the rest of the episode talking about Mordecai's interactions with his current and former lover, let's go ahead and quickly talk about everything else going on in this episode. Besides this being a surprisingly common Rigby is actually a good friend with bad moments and not a bad friend with good moments kind of episode, the stuff with him and Eileen throughout this one are just really adorable from start to finish. On the other side of the spectrum, the stuff with Starla and Muscle Man is great too, as watching them be completely inappropriate in every single frame is a hilarious delight throughout. Anyway, enough dancing around it, as after Mordecai is once again jump scared, this time by his current girlfriend, he first tries to not have to tell CJ why he's so jumpy, at least until the reason he's so jumpy shows up and makes them do so anyway. Something I really love about the only conversation between this episode's three main characters is how, in an episode that's been all about how awkward and nervous Mordecai is, the scene consists of all three of them being noticeable notably awkward and uncomfortable until Margaret leaves. While Mordecai is the one who ultimately becomes the biggest perpetrator of this episode's negative impact on the three of them, there's no denying that CJ, and especially Margaret, don't exactly handle the situation with grace either. From this point on, the episode definitely has an agenda that permeates until the very end, which is to make CJ seem like the perfect girl in every conceivable way. Even though she also can't completely negate the awkwardness, the show writes CJ to still handle the situation significantly better than anybody else here, and in such a way that intentionally makes the audience feel like Mordecai has found a relationship that's perfect for him. Eventually, CJ has to go to the bathroom, and without her to guide Mordecai, the trouble he foresaw at the beginning of the episode quickly approaches. The sequence that Mordecai is about to unfortunately experience is one of my favorite to ever come out of the show, as it genuinely has some of the best visuals and writing that the series has ever produced. After Mordecai is jump scared for the third time in this episode, he accidentally launches the mistletoe disco ball into the perhaps implied to be spiked eggnog, as the show launches into the absolutely beautiful bright red color palette that colors this entire scene. A change in visuals that brings both a nightmarish hue to Mordecai's nightmarish situation, while also causing him to see dozens of Margarets, mirroring just how overwhelming of a situation this has become for him. As the pair continues to talk, Mordecai continues to spiral, only being launched out of it when Margaret mentions the good times they shared. By being forced to remember the good times he shared with Margaret, Mordecai realizes that he has achieved the same feeling by being together with CJ, finally having the conversation that he should have had much earlier in the episode. It's a really sweet moment where the pair discuss how much fun they've had together, but that ultimately it's time to move on, as they share a hug to celebrate their mutual understanding. The scene is capped off with a montage borrowed from Margaret's last episode, with the characters having a good time together, as they both finally accept they can be friends, even if their romantic relationship is—
No!
Oh my gosh.
I didn't mean to do
really
that.
wasn't. I mean, Mordecai?
Going into making this video, I of course knew what was going to happen, and yet every single time I had to rewatch this episode for this video, the cut to Margaret and Mordecai kissing always hits like a ton of bricks, especially with how immediate and how viscerally brutal CJ's reaction is to seeing this. As Mordecai realizes just how much he screwed up here, we genuinely get some of the best looking shots of the season, as he sprints at CJ to try and calm her down, a venture that's ultimately fruitless. The episode isn't done yet though, as Mordecai finally discovers what Eileen's mysterious third announcement was, finding out that Margaret's return is permanent, and that everything he just went through was just the beginning. What really emphasizes this feeling is the look across the hall that he and Margaret share to end this episode, as they both realize the situation that their actions have put them into. Mordecai and CJ breaking up at the end of this episode is not something that ultimately lasts past the next quarter hour, but the events of this one do kick off the love triangle between the pair and Margaret that colors the remainder of their relationship. And while there are some things to be said about how Margaret is arguably just as at fault as Mordecai for their kiss at the end, especially with just how aware she is of his new girlfriend, I think it's fairly obvious that this episode was meant to highlight Mordecai's struggle throughout this one, being both how easily he was pushed into making such a jerkish decision and how immediately gutted he felt when he saw CJ's reaction to it. And that's something that I somewhat struggled with when writing this script, as despite the fact that CJ is unequivocally the victim here after Mordecai does such a callous thing, it's pretty impossible to not feel sorry for our main character. We see see firsthand just how badly Mordecai doesn't want to mess this up, and just how much anxiety he has over doing something a fraction as bad as this. And with a scene as well written as the conversation between him and Margaret before the montage, you become so attached to Mordecai in this episode, which makes the big kiss of this episode hit the viewer just as hard as it hits CJ. As the audience, we relate to Mordecai's struggle throughout this episode, and we also share his appreciation for CJ, which causes such a visceral combination of rage, confusion, and sorrow when the montage fades to reveal what he's done. Ultimately, the Mordecai who kissed Margaret in the heat of the moment is the same Mordecai who has to deal with the repercussions of doing so, but also, at the same time, feels like a completely different character. In the sea of wackiness that is regular show, Merry Christmas Mordecai delivers such an immense amount of realism that the characters just aren't able to handle very well. This episode, just like the rest of the love triangle between Margaret, Mordecai, and CJ, is purposefully very awkward. Something that obviously turned off some viewers, but is also something the show does very well to mirror the awkwardness of life. Despite being this fantastical series with magic and ghosts and talking animals, regular show is one of Cartoon Network's most realistic feeling cartoons. And while some of this comes from things like how the characters talk, it also comes from things like the horrendous pit-in-the-stomach feeling that both the series, just like life, sometimes gives you. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want to tell me how awful this episode is in a way that's harder to ignore in the comments, you can find my Twitter in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week for one final video for the year. Happy holidays, and thanks for watching.